So there I was, staring at 10 illegal vacation cabins on my private island, watching this HOA Karen named Delilah Thornbrook pocket $20,000 every single week, while she had the absolute audacity to call the cops on me for trespassing on land my family has owned since 1923. The morning mist rising off Lake Winnebago couldn't mask the sound of her shrill voice echoing across the water, something about unauthorized personnel disrupting the guest experience. This woman, dripping in fake authority with her embroidered polo and gold-plated clipboard, was literally making more money in 1 month than most people see all year, off my land. But here's what this delusional wannabe real estate mogul had no clue about. Buried in my great-grandfather's dusty old deed was a legal nuclear bomb that would obliterate her $1-million scam and leave her begging for mercy. What would you do if someone was making $80,000 a month off your property while threatening to arrest you? Drop A if you're living the dream, or A if you're trapped in HOA hell. Let me back up and tell you how I ended up in this absolute circus. My name is Jasper Caldwell, 52, retired electrician from Milwaukee who thought retirement meant fishing in peace, not battling a wannabe real estate mogul with delusions of grandeur. Pine Needle Island, all 4.3 glorious acres, has been in my family since my great-grandfather Ezra bought it in 1923 for what amounts to a decent dinner today. Growing up, that island was our sanctuary. Every summer, Dad and I would putt-putt out there in his ancient fishing boat, the smell of two-stroke oil mixing with fresh lake air and the promise of adventure. We'd camp under stars so bright they hurt your eyes, cook walleye over crackling fires, and listen to Grandpa Ezra's stories about when Lake Winnebago was still wild country. The cabin we built in the 70s wasn't the Ritz, 3 rooms, leaky roof, and a screened porch held together by duct tape and prayers, but to a suburban kid, it was paradise. Then life happened with all the grace of a drunk moose. College, marriage, kids, career, and a job transfer that dragged me to Florida for 15 years of sweating and missing real seasons. The cabin got old, the roof gave up, and when that monster storm in 2019 finally put it out of its misery, I figured I'd deal with it eventually. You know how eventually works. It's code for when hell freezes over. Enter Delilah Thornbrook, stage left, with all the subtlety of a tornado in a trailer park. This delightful specimen moved to Riverbend Shores in 2020, fresh from Chicago with a white BMW sporting a blessed license plate, which should have been everyone's first red flag. Within 6 months, she'd crowned herself HOA president and appointed herself supreme commander of everything within eyeshot. Her signature move? Recording violations on her phone while using that customer service voice that makes dentist drills sound pleasant. When I finally dragged myself back to Wisconsin last spring, newly single, financially lighter, and dreaming of rebuilding, I discovered Delilah's little surprise. 10 matching log cabins arranged across my island like a perverted summer camp. Professional Airbnb signs everywhere. Thornbrook Island Retreat, $350 night. Security cameras, expanded docks, even a cutesy gift shop painted in that fake rustic style that makes real outdoorsmen weep. The sound of power tools hammered across the water as crews built Cabin 11. Fresh cedar scent mixed with diesel fumes and something else. The unmistakable smell of money being extracted from stolen property. My boots crunched on composite decking that had murdered the natural shoreline where Grandpa used to skip stones. That's when Her Majesty emerged from the main cabin like she was accepting a Nobel Prize, clutching her sacred clipboard and wearing a property manager polo that probably cost more than my truck payment. "Excuse me, this is private property," she announced with the authority of someone who'd never been told no. I pulled out my deed, the real McCoy, complete with county seal and everything. "You're absolutely right. This is private property. Mine." Her face went through more expressions than a soap opera actress before settling on righteous indignation. "Impossible. This was abandoned land. Adverse possession laws clearly state I have rights after improving neglected property. Here's your knowledge nugget. Adverse possession requires hostile, actual, open, notorious, and continuous use for the statutory period. In Wisconsin, that's 20 years minimum. The key takeaway? You can't just squat on someone's land and claim ownership after a couple years. Lady, you've been here 18 months, tops. Wisconsin law requires 20 years. That's when the mask dropped faster than a lead balloon. The fake smile vanished, replaced by something that belonged in a nature documentary about predators. Listen, Whoever you think you are, I've invested everything into this business. I have insurance, permits, and lawyers who will bury you if you try interfering with my legal operation." 20 minutes later, I was being escorted off my own island by a deputy who turned out to be Delilah's next-door neighbor, while she threatened criminal charges for harassment and attempted fraud. But Princess Clipboard had no idea she was picking a fight with a Navy Seabee who'd spent 20 years learning that the right tools and the right plan can level mountains. The next morning, I woke up to a sheriff's deputy knocking on my motel room door with a restraining order that read like bad fiction. Apparently, I had threatened violence and attempted intimidation against poor, innocent Delilah. The woman had submitted security footage showing me aggressively approaching her property, which was really just me walking on my own damn land looking confused. But Hollywood couldn't have edited it better to make me look like a crazed lunatic. Judge Morrison, who probably spent more time reading his breakfast menu than my case file, granted a temporary injunction preventing me from going within 500 feet of the disputed property. 500 feet! I couldn't even get close enough to count the illegal docks from the water. Meanwhile, Delilah was raking in another $20,000 that week while I sat in a Motel 6 eating gas station sandwiches. But Princess Clipboard wasn't content with just legal warfare. She launched a full-scale propaganda campaign that would have made Joseph Goebbels proud. She flooded local Facebook groups with sob stories about this dangerous drifter from Florida trying to steal her American dream. The smell of fresh coffee and manufactured outrage filled the Riverbend Community Center as she held court at the weekly HOA meeting, complete with crocodile tears and a victim complex the size of Texas. This man appeared out of nowhere claiming ownership of property that's been abandoned for years, she told the assembled crowd, dabbing her eyes with tissues that probably cost more than most people's lunch. "I've invested my life savings, created jobs, brought tourism revenue to our beautiful community. Now he wants to destroy everything because of some dusty old piece of paper that could be fake for all we know." 3 HOA board members, coincidentally, all within smelling distance of her money, signed affidavits supporting her claim. The local Riverbend Gazette ran a puff piece titled "Local Businesswoman Fights Attempted Land Grab," complete with a photo of Delilah looking like Mother Teresa in a polo shirt. The reporter never bothered calling me for comment, probably because Delilah told him I was too unstable for interviews. While she was busy playing victim on social media, I was getting my hands dirty in the basement of the Winnebago County Courthouse. Let me tell you, 20 years as an electrician teaches you that the real answers are usually hidden in the places nobody wants to look, like courthouse basements that smell like mothballs and broken dreams but contain legal gold if you know how to dig. That's when I remembered something my old mentor used to say. Property deeds are like electrical schematics. The devil's in the details everyone ignores. He was right. Most people just look at the summary from their title company, but I'd learned from rewiring old houses that you always go back to the original blueprints. So I requested the complete 1923 deed, not just the modern copy, and struck legal uranium. My great-grandfather's deed wasn't just about surface ownership. It included riparian rights extending 200 feet into Lake Winnebago. Every single one of Delilah's fancy docks violated those water rights. Better yet, her boat rental operation required commercial permits from the Wisconsin DNR that she'd conveniently forgotten to obtain. Operating without those permits carried fines that would make a lottery winner nervous. But the real kicker came when I started digging through tax records. Remember how she claimed the land was abandoned and she had adverse possession rights? Well, this brilliant legal scholar had been paying property taxes on the island for 18 months and writing it off as a business expense on her federal taxes. Her LLC filing with the state literally listed the property as acquired through adverse possession pending legal confirmation. The woman knew the ownership was questionable but had been treating my island like her personal piggy bank anyway. It was like watching someone rob a bank while filling out a loan application for the same money. Time to bring in the heavy artillery. I hired Stella Vaughn, a probate attorney who looked like everyone's sweet grandmother until she started discussing property law, then transformed into a legal shark with reading glasses and zero tolerance for nonsense. "Jasper," she said after reviewing my evidence, her pen scratching notes like a woodpecker on steroids, "this woman has violated so many laws I'm getting carpal tunnel just listing them. Riparian rights violations, unpermitted commercial operations, false tax filings, perjury on the restraining order application. It's like she used a magic 8-ball to make legal decisions." We filed a countersuit that read like a property owner's revenge fantasy: theft, fraud, conversion, riparian rights violations, and operating without permits. Total damages: $900,000 in stolen rental income plus removal costs for all unauthorized improvements. But here's where it got delicious. Stella's paralegal discovered that Delilah's restraining order was completely bogus. The security footage she'd submitted to prove I was threatening actually showed me checking my phone and scratching my head, hardly the behavior of someone planning violence. She'd committed perjury to get that order, and in Wisconsin, lying under oath bites back harder than a rabid badger. Within a week, we had the restraining order dissolved and Delilah explaining to her increasingly nervous lawyer why she'd lied in court. The woman who thought she could bulldoze a Navy Seabee was about to learn what happens when you bring a clipboard to a legal gunfight. Just when I thought Delilah couldn't get more desperate, she pulled out a move that would have impressed a Vegas con artist. 3 days after losing her restraining order, I got a call from some outfit called Winnebago Hospitality Group, offering to buy my island for the bargain basement price of $75,000. The voice on the phone had all the charm of a used car salesman trying to unload a lemon, talking fast about cash offers, and closing within the week. It took Stella's investigator about 10 minutes to trace the shell company back to Delilah's mother's address in Kenosha. This woman was trying to buy stolen property from the guy she'd stolen it from, using a fake company that probably existed only on paper and wishful thinking. When I declined her generous offer to rob myself, the gloves came off completely. Suddenly, my life became a series of unfortunate coincidences that would have made Lemony Snicket jealous. My boat trailer mysteriously developed flat tires in the marina parking lot, both sides naturally. The security cameras at the courthouse started malfunctioning every time I showed up to do research, leaving gaps in the footage that looked like Swiss cheese. Fake online reviews appeared claiming I'd harassed vacationing families and threatened their children, complete with photos that were obviously photoshopped, but convincing enough to fool people who get their news from Facebook memes. The smell of diesel and desperation hung over the marina as Delilah's maintenance crew, which looked suspiciously like the guys who'd been building her illegal empire, worked overtime to make my visits as unpleasant as possible. They'd rev their engines whenever I tried to use my phone, blast country music at volumes that violated several noise ordinances, and generally act like territorial guerrillas protecting their banana supply. But the real masterstroke came when someone filed an anonymous tip with the Wisconsin DNR claiming I was poaching fish illegally and harassing wildlife. This resulted in a visit from Conservation Warden Johnson, a no-nonsense woman who looked like she could arrest a grizzly bear with her bare hands. After 20 minutes of explaining my situation and showing her my valid fishing license, she started asking very pointed questions about who might have made such a ridiculous complaint. Meanwhile, Delilah was working social media like a part-time influencer with a full-time victim complex. She created a Facebook group called Save Riverbend Tourism that attracted every small-town gossip and keyboard warrior within 50 miles. The posts were masterpieces of selective editing, video clips showing me arguing aggressively that conveniently cut off right before showing her screaming like a banshee, and testimonials from concerned citizens who'd probably never set foot on the lake. Local Channel 7 picked up the story as a classic David versus Goliath battle, except they cast Little Miss Clipboard as David fighting the big scary veteran. The irony was thicker than Wisconsin cheese, a woman stealing nearly $1 million in property portraying herself as the underdog against a guy living in a motel and eating ramen noodles. But while Delilah was busy playing the victim card like a professional poker player, I was learning some very interesting things about her financial situation. You know how they say follow the money? Well, I followed it right into a crater the size of Lake Superior. Court records from Illinois showed that our entrepreneurial hero owed $380,000 on her mainland property, thanks to a failed business venture called Thornbrook Event Planning that had crashed and burned harder than the Hindenburg. The bankruptcy filing made for fascinating reading. Apparently, Delilah had a talent for aggressive expansion, followed by spectacular failure. She'd tried running a boutique, a catering company, and some kind of consulting firm, each one ending in lawsuits and angry creditors. The island rental income wasn't just her main revenue source. It was her only revenue source, the financial life raft keeping her from drowning in debt. This revelation led to another discovery that made my electrician's brain practically short-circuit with excitement. Remember how she'd been inflating her rental numbers to look successful? Well, she'd been using those same inflated numbers to secure additional business loans from 3 different banks. The woman was living in a house of cards built on a foundation of lies, and I was about to become a very strong wind. Stella had been busy too, digging up a 1987 Wisconsin Supreme Court case called Muller-Ver Shoreline Developments that was so perfect for our situation, it was like legal destiny. The case established that paying property taxes under mistaken ownership doesn't create legal title, and that commercial operations actually work against adverse possession claims rather than supporting them. In other words, every dollar Delilah made from her illegal rentals was evidence against her own case. The community support was starting to shift too, like a tide turning after the storm. I'd connected with some of my great-grandfather's old fishing buddies, guys in their 70s and 80s who remembered the Caldwell family reunions on the island going back to the 1960s. They had photo albums full of evidence showing continuous family use, and they were madder than wet hornets about what Delilah had done to their fishing spots. Even better, the local environmental group, Friends of Lake Winnebago, had started documenting the ecological damage from her overdevelopment. Turns out, cramming 10 cabins and their septic systems onto a small island does terrible things to water quality and fish habitat. Mother Nature was building her own case against Princess Clipboard, and she didn't need a lawyer to make her point. 2 weeks later, Delilah played what she thought was her nuclear card. She produced an elderly gentleman named Harold Finch, her mother's boyfriend, who claimed he'd witnessed my great-grandfather Ezra sell the island in a handshake deal back in 1985. According to Harold's suddenly crystal-clear memory, Grandpa Ezra had agreed to sell for $5,000 cash to some developer, making my deed worthless paper. The whole thing stunk worse than week-old fish bait, but Delilah paraded poor Harold around like he was the star witness in the trial of the century. She even got him on local TV, where he told his story with the conviction of someone who'd been coached more than a Super Bowl quarterback. "Oh yes, I remember it clear as day," he said, his voice shaking with either age or nerves. "Ezra needed the money for medical bills. Said the island was more trouble than it was worth." Based on this testimony, Delilah convinced the county prosecutor to open a criminal investigation against me for document fraud. Suddenly, I wasn't just fighting a civil case. I was potentially facing felony charges for forging historical documents and attempting to defraud a legitimate business owner. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a chainsaw. But here's where Delilah's desperation started showing. She hired some Chicago PR firm to completely reframe the narrative. Suddenly, she wasn't just a businesswoman. She was Grandma Delilah, an elderly widow who'd invested her late husband's life insurance into bringing economic opportunity to rural Wisconsin. The GoFundMe she set up raised $23,000 in 2 weeks, complete with photos of her looking frail and vulnerable that must have required professional lighting. The regional newspaper chain, owned by her golf buddy from the country club, ran a series of sympathetic articles painting me as a Florida con man preying on honest Midwest values. The headlines alone were works of fiction. Elderly businesswoman fights off land scammer and out-of-state fraudster targets local tourism. If I didn't know better, I'd have thought I was reading about someone else entirely. Meanwhile, her lawyer started playing financial hardball that would have made a mob enforcer proud. They demanded I pay $50,000 in storage fees for the cabin construction materials, another $12,000 for security services during my alleged trespassing incidents, and threatened to sue for $200,000 in lost business revenue during the legal proceedings. Their settlement offer was simple. Pay $75,000 and they'd make the whole thing disappear quietly. That's when Stella's paralegal made a discovery that changed everything. While reviewing the original courthouse filings for the 100th time, she noticed something that had been staring us in the face all along. My great-grandfather's 1923 deed had been recorded in 2 counties, the original in Winnebago County and a certified copy in Fond du Lac County. I remembered my dad mentioning this once, back when I was a teenager more interested in fishing than family history. "Your great-grandpa was paranoid about losing important papers," he'd said. "Always filed everything twice, sometimes 3 times, just to be safe." At the time, I thought it was just old-fashioned overkill, but Ezra's paranoia was about to save my bacon. The Fond du Lac County version included detailed meets and bounds surveys that the Winnebago copy had somehow lost over the decades. These surveys clearly showed the island boundaries extended beyond where Delilah's cabin sat, meaning she'd built some of them on land that was unquestionably, indisputably mine, according to two separate county records dating back a century. But the real bombshell came when the Wisconsin Historical Society got involved. They brought in paper experts, handwriting analysts, and archivists who treated those old documents like archaeological treasures. The paper stock matched other 1923 county documents perfectly. The ink composition was consistent with era-appropriate materials, and the handwriting matched samples from the original county clerk's other filings. Forging documents this accurately would require resources and expertise that didn't exist in 1923, explained Dr. Margaret Webb, the state's leading expert on historical document authentication. You'd essentially need a time machine and a team of master forgers. The probability of fraud is essentially zero. Meanwhile, Harold Finch's credibility was crumbling faster than a sandcastle in a hurricane. Stella's investigation revealed that Harold had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia in 2018, with medical records clearly showing progressive cognitive decline. His doctor confirmed that his long-term memory had become significantly unreliable, especially for specific dates and details from decades past. Even more damaging was the discovery of a $5,000 consulting fee that Delilah had paid Harold just 2 weeks before his miraculous memory recovery. Bank records don't lie, even when witnesses do, and suddenly the county prosecutor was asking very pointed questions about witness tampering and perjury. The criminal investigation against me evaporated overnight when prosecutors realized they'd been played by a woman whose desperation had finally outpaced her cunning. Delilah went from criminal complainant to potential defendant faster than you could say obstruction of justice, and her legal team started looking like they'd rather be anywhere else on earth. But I was just getting warmed up. With 2 counties' worth of documentation, expert testimony, and proof of witness tampering, I had everything I needed to not just win my island back, but to make sure Delilah learned an expensive lesson about the difference between confidence and competence. 3 months into this legal circus, Stella called me with excitement crackling in her voice like electricity through wet wires. She'd been doing what she called archaeological lawyering through my great-grandfather's papers. Old Ezra apparently kept records like he was planning to be audited by God himself. "Jasper, pour yourself something strong and sit down," she said. "I just found a 1924 amendment that's going to make Delilah wish she'd never heard of Lake Winnebago." The document was tucked inside a manila folder that smelled like cedar and forgotten dreams, filed separately from the main deed because Ezra was the kind of man who believed in belt and suspenders legal protection. The amendment was beautifully clear, written in that formal language from when lawyers used English instead of gibberish. No permanent structures shall be erected that would impede extraction of mineral deposits beneath said property. Every single cabin violated that clause just by existing. But here's where Ezra's forward thinking got really interesting. Back in 1920, geological surveys had identified premium-grade gravel deposits under Pine Needle Island, the kind of lake-washed aggregate that makes construction companies drool and write very large checks. Grandpa had planned a gravel operation but died before implementation, leaving his descendants sitting on what amounted to a buried treasure chest. I remembered those old survey maps from childhood visits to Grandpa's basement, rolled up in tubes and covered with dust thick enough to plant crops in. Back then, they looked like hieroglyphics to a kid more interested in fishing than geology. Now those meaningless squiggles were about to become the most expensive lesson in property law Delilah would ever receive. Stella brought in geologists who confirmed the deposit's value, $2.3 million worth of gravel sleeping peacefully under my island, accessible only if the surface was cleared of permanent structures. The irony was delicious. Delilah had built her empire directly on top of wealth that could have made us both rich if she'd bothered asking permission instead of just taking what wasn't hers. Wisconsin mineral rights law is beautifully brutal in its simplicity. Violations trigger automatic trespass with triple damages, and the surface owner becomes responsible for removing interfering structures at their own expense. Not only would Delilah have to demolish her $1 million investment, but she'd have to pay contractors to destroy her own dreams, while I watched from a lawn chair with popcorn. Meanwhile, My private investigator had been following Delilah's money trail like a forensic accountant with a personal vendetta. Her financial situation was more precarious than a house of cards in a windstorm. The $500,000 loan she'd used for cabin construction was secured with revenue projections based on a 20-year exclusive lease that existed only in her imagination. When banks discover loan fraud, they don't just demand their money back. They trigger cross-default clauses that can force foreclosure on everything the borrower owns. Delilah's personal guarantees meant her mainland house, her BMW, probably her designer clipboard collection. Everything was now at risk because she'd bet the farm on stolen property. The sound of her financial house collapsing was almost musical, like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. Monthly payments exceeded her legitimate income by $8,000, forcing her to rob Peter to pay Paul while Peter was filing criminal charges and Paul was hiring collection agencies. As I sat in Stella's office, surrounded by evidence that could destroy another human being's life completely, I kept hearing my great-grandfather's voice from childhood summers. Real victory isn't about crushing your enemies, Jasper. It's about building something better from the mess they leave behind. I had the nuclear option. Complete legal authority to force immediate demolition with zero compensation. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to turn this disaster into something that served the community instead of just feeding my hunger for revenge. After all, the best revenge isn't destruction. It's building something so beautiful that everyone remembers what could have been accomplished through cooperation instead of theft. The next morning, I walked into Stella's office to find what looked like a war room designed by lawyers with too much coffee and not enough sleep. She'd assembled what she called the Dream Team, a collection of legal professionals who specialized in turning property disputes into cautionary tales. Rosa Martinez, environmental lawyer extraordinaire, had driven up from Madison with a briefcase full of water rights violations that would make the EPA weep with joy. She looked like she could argue a fish out of water and make it thank her for the experience. "Jasper, I've been fighting lakefront development cases for 15 years, she said, spreading aerial photos across the conference table. What Delilah did to your island is like using a chainsaw for brain surgery. Messy, illegal, and guaranteed to leave permanent damage." Agent Frank Kowalski from the Wisconsin DNR had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades protecting natural resources from people who thought environmental laws were suggestions. He'd brought a thick folder of violations that read like a horror novel for fish and wildlife. 10 septic systems on a 4.3-acre island, he muttered, shaking his head. The contamination levels we're seeing would kill a small lake. This woman turned your family heritage into an ecological disaster zone. Retired Judge Cornelius Wright completed our legal brain trust. At 73, he'd seen every property scam imaginable and had zero patience for people who thought money could buy them out of stupidity. The key, he explained while cleaning his glasses, is offering her a way out that saves face while protecting your interests. Corner a desperate person completely, and they'll burn everything down out of spite. Our strategy session felt like planning D-Day, except instead of liberating Europe, we were liberating a small island from a woman with delusions of grandeur. We identified 3 parallel legal tracks: mineral rights violations, commercial trespass, and environmental damage. Each one alone could destroy her financially. Together, they formed a legal tsunami that would wash away her empire and leave her wondering what hit her. Rosa explained something called the clean hands doctrine. Courts favor parties who haven't engaged in wrongdoing themselves. Since I'd never lied, cheated, or built illegal structures, I had what lawyers call the moral high ground, and judges call the obvious winner. Meanwhile, Delilah had accumulated more violations than a parking meter in downtown Chicago. But here's what I learned about mineral rights from my crash course in property law. Imagine ownership like a layer cake, where you can own the frosting without owning the actual cake underneath. Most people assume buying land gives them everything from the center of the earth to outer space. But mineral rights can be sold separately, creating invisible boundaries that explode into very visible lawsuits when someone builds where they shouldn't. The environmental implications were staggering. Forensic accountant Madison Cross had been analyzing Delilah's books like an IRS agent with a personal grudge, discovering she'd been skimming cash payments to avoid taxes on 30% of her rental income. She's been operating a cash business while filing tax returns that would make Al Capone blush, Madison explained. Unreported income totaling $280,000, could result in federal criminal charges that make civil court look like a church social. While the lawyers planned legal warfare, I was building community support that would have made a politician jealous. The Veterans of Foreign Wars chapter provided moral backup. Turns out, military folks don't appreciate when civilians steal from fellow veterans. The local environmental group, Friends of Lake Winnebago, had documented ecological damage that looked like before and after photos from an environmental disaster movie. Even the fishing guides were mobilizing, reporting declining fish populations since Delilah's septic systems started poisoning spawning beds. Captain Mike Kowalski, Frank's brother and a 30-year fishing veteran, had photos showing dead zones around the cabin areas that looked like aquatic graveyards. She killed more fish in 18 months than I've seen die from natural causes in 3 decades, he said, his weathered hands shaking with anger. The media strategy was pure genius. Retired journalist Beverly Storm agreed to document everything in exchange for exclusive access, but with one condition: the story had to focus on environmental protection rather than personal revenge. David versus Goliath sells papers, she explained, but environmental destruction sells souls. Frame this as protecting Wisconsin's natural heritage, and you'll have public opinion eating out of your hand. Our negotiation preparation involved 3 settlement offers ranging from generous to nuclear. Option A let Delilah keep cabin ownership while paying $200,000 for mineral rights access, essentially buying permission to continue her illegal operation. Option B required her to remove all structures at her own expense while I waived financial damages. Option C involved full enforcement of every legal right I possessed, guaranteeing her complete financial destruction. Stella's psychological profile suggested Delilah fit the pattern of what she diplomatically called a malignant narcissist, someone who'd escalate rather than negotiate reasonably when cornered. Expect emotional manipulation, fake tears, and victim playing worthy of an Oscar nomination, she warned. This woman will burn her own house down before admitting she was wrong. As we prepared for what felt like the legal equivalent of the final showdown in a Western movie, I couldn't help thinking about my great-grandfather's stories of helping neighbors during tough times. Maybe there was a way to turn this mess into something that served the community, instead of just satisfying my desire for justice. Just when I thought Delilah couldn't sink any lower, she proved that desperate people have no bottom to their barrel of bad ideas. Within 48 hours of our legal team formation, she launched what could only be described as a going-out-of-business sale for stolen property. Suddenly, all 10 cabins appeared on real estate websites at fire sale prices, $45,000 each for luxury lakefront retreats that normally would cost twice that much. Her sales pitch was pure snake oil salesmanship. Investment opportunity won't last long, minor paperwork dispute being resolved quickly. She was literally trying to sell my own property to innocent buyers who'd become unwitting accomplices in her fraud. The woman had more nerve than a dentist with Parkinson's disease. But the real masterpiece was her social media blitzkrieg. Delilah hired some outfit from Milwaukee that specialized in reputation management, which is apparently code for making guilty people look like victims on Facebook. Suddenly, my phone started buzzing with notifications from fake accounts flooding every local group with stories about how this dangerous PTSD veteran was threatening peaceful business people and trying to destroy the local economy. The posts were works of fiction that would have made Stephen King jealous. Anonymous accounts with generic names like Concerned Mom 2024 and Riverbend Resident shared eyewitness accounts of me screaming at children, threatening tourists, and exhibiting clearly unstable behavior that endangers our community. The photos were obviously doctored, my head photoshopped onto the body of someone twice my size, throwing what appeared to be a temper tantrum. Meanwhile, her maintenance crew had transformed the marina into a construction zone that smelled like diesel fuel and intimidation. These guys, who looked like they'd been recruited from a biker bar's rejection pile, would rev their engines whenever I tried to make phone calls, blast country music at volumes that probably violated the Geneva Convention, and generally act like territorial guerrillas protecting their banana supply. The harassment campaign reached peak stupidity when someone, and I have my suspicions about who, filed another anonymous tip with the DNR claiming I was operating an illegal fishing guide service and harassing protected wildlife. This resulted in a surprise visit from Conservation Warden Johnson and 2 of her colleagues who showed up at my motel room at 6 a.m. looking like they expected to find a major poaching operation. After 20 minutes of showing them my fishing licenses, military ID, and explaining the property situation, Warden Johnson's expression shifted from suspicious to sympathetic to downright annoyed. "Mr. Caldwell, someone's been filing a lot of complaints about you lately, all of them anonymous, all of them unsubstantiated, and all of them coming from the same IP address. You wouldn't happen to know anyone who might have a grudge against you, would you?" But while Delilah was busy playing dirty tricks that would have embarrassed a middle school bully, my team was uncovering information that made her financial situation look like the Titanic's last few minutes. Court records from 3 states revealed a pattern of business failures that followed her around like a bad credit rating with legs. The bankruptcy filing from her Illinois event planning company read like a masterclass in how not to run a business. She'd expanded too fast, spent money she didn't have, and when creditors came calling, she'd simply declared bankruptcy and moved to Wisconsin to start fresh. Except fresh start apparently meant same terrible business practices, different state. More damaging was the discovery that her island rental income wasn't just her main revenue source, it was her only legitimate income. Every dollar she'd made in the past 18 months came from my stolen property. She was like a parasite that had attached itself to my family's legacy and been feeding off it ever since. The private investigator's report revealed that she'd been using inflated rental projections to secure loans from multiple banks simultaneously. The same fake revenue numbers that made her look successful on paper had been submitted to 3 different lenders, none of whom knew about the others. When banks discover they've been lied to about collateral and income, they don't just get upset, they get criminal investigators involved. But the most delicious discovery came from her own lawyer's files. Remember Pike, her first attorney who'd withdrawn from the case? Well, he'd kept detailed records of every conversation, and privilege doesn't protect communications about ongoing crimes. His notes included direct quotes from Delilah discussing how to make evidence disappear, and coaching witnesses to remember things differently. The woman who'd been playing victim on social media had been caught on record discussing evidence tampering, witness coaching, and what amounted to conspiracy to commit fraud. Pike had documented everything because he'd apparently realized his client was steering their legal ship straight toward the rocks and wanted to make sure he had a lifeboat ready. By the time our investigators finished following the money trail, Delilah's empire looked less like a successful business and more like a criminal enterprise with a good marketing department. The woman who'd accused me of being a scammer had been running a multi-million-dollar scam that made my alleged crimes look like jaywalking compared to armed robbery. But the real bombshell was still coming. Because while she was busy destroying her own credibility faster than a politician during election season, we'd discovered something about her identity that would make all her other problems look like practice rounds for the main event. 3 days later, Delilah completely lost whatever remained of her sanity and tried to burn down cabin number 3 for the insurance money. The security cameras she'd installed to spy on me caught her red-handed at 2 a.m., dousing the structure with gasoline from a red container that still had the receipt from Murphy's gas station in her BMW's cup holder. For someone who'd spent months calling me unstable, she was doing a spectacular job of demonstrating what actual crazy looked like. The fire department arrived faster than pizza delivery, which was unfortunate for Delilah's master plan but excellent for the rest of us who prefer our lakes without floating charcoal. Fire Marshal Roberts took one look at the gasoline residue, the melted plastic container, and Delilah standing nearby smelling like a gas station explosion, and called it the easiest arson case he'd seen since someone tried to claim their ex-wife's car spontaneously combusted in the Walmart parking lot. The insurance company's response was swift and brutal. All claims denied immediately, coverage canceled retroactively, and a criminal referral to the state attorney general's office for attempted fraud. Delilah went from potential victim to actual defendant faster than her fake tears could dry, with bail set at $50,000 that her broke behind couldn't afford. But that's when our investigation hit the mother lode of all discoveries. Illinois State Police had been looking for someone named Dolores Thornberry, wanted for real estate fraud involving $300,000 stolen from an elderly couple in Rockford. The fingerprints from Delilah's booking matched perfectly with their fugitive database, revealing that our HOA Karen wasn't just a local scammer, but a career criminal who'd been operating under a false identity for 3 years. The elderly couple she'd victimized in Illinois were Harold and Margaret Kowalski, no relation to our DNR agent, just 2 retirees who'd trusted the wrong person with their life savings. Dolores had convinced them to invest in a guaranteed return real estate development that existed only in her imagination. When they tried to get their money back, They discovered she'd vanished along with their retirement fund and their faith in humanity. Her probation officer from the Illinois case had been looking for her since 2021, when she'd failed to report for her monthly check-in and disappeared like smoke in the wind. Operating the island rental business under a false identity, while on probation for financial fraud, wasn't just stupid. It was a federal crime that carried serious prison time with no possibility of the kind of legal gymnastics that had kept her out of trouble before. The fake identity documents were impressive enough to fool most casual observers, but crumbled under professional scrutiny faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. Birth certificate, social security card, driver's license, all expertly forged but traceable to a document mill in Chicago that specialized in helping people disappear from their past mistakes. Unfortunately for Dolores, now Delilah, the FBI had been tracking that particular operation for months. Meanwhile, her remaining supporters were abandoning ship like rats from the Titanic. The crisis management firm she'd hired issued a terse statement terminating all professional relationships effective immediately, after learning their client was a wanted fugitive. The HOA board voted unanimously to remove her as president and expel her from the organization, with one member commenting that, "We don't associate with criminals, regardless of their customer service skills." Most painfully, her own mother publicly disowned her during a live radio interview that became local legend. "I don't have a daughter named Delilah," Mrs. Thornberry announced with the finality of a judge passing sentence. "I raised Dolores to be better than this, but apparently some people are determined to make their own choices and live with the consequences." The financial house of cards she'd built on my stolen island was collapsing with mathematical precision. Business bank accounts frozen by court order, personal accounts seized for environmental cleanup costs, and every piece of rental equipment from generators to furniture being repossessed by companies that had finally figured out they'd been doing business with a ghost. The booking cancellations started immediately when news broke about her arrest. Families who'd planned Lake Winnebago vacations suddenly discovered they'd given deposits to a wanted criminal operating illegal accommodations on stolen property. The refund requests created a stampede toward empty bank accounts that couldn't satisfy a fraction of the demands. But the most satisfying moment came when her fourth lawyer, she was burning through legal representation faster than she burned through other people's money, filed a motion requesting protective custody because Dolores was receiving death threats from defrauded victims. And the woman who'd spent months painting me as a dangerous criminal was now begging for police protection from the people she'd actually victimized. Standing in Stella's office, watching the evening news cover the Delilah Thornbrook identity fraud scandal, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Genuine satisfaction mixed with a healthy dose of anticipation. Tomorrow was the emergency court hearing that would determine whether this career criminal would finally face consequences for her actions, or if she'd somehow slip through the cracks one more time. But after watching her burn down her own cabin while standing in a puddle of gasoline, I was pretty confident that luck had officially run out for the woman with more aliases than a spy novel and less sense than a box of rocks. The morning of the emergency court hearing felt like the Super Bowl, election night, and a public execution all rolled into one media circus that would have made P.T. Barnum weep with envy. By 8 a.m., the Winnebago County Courthouse parking lot looked like a tailgate party for justice, with 3 TV news trucks, 2 radio station vans, and enough reporters to staff a small newspaper camped outside the building. Judge Patricia Blackwood, a former environmental prosecutor who'd built her reputation by making corporate polluters cry into their offshore bank accounts, was presiding over what everyone knew would be the final act of Delilah's theatrical production. The courtroom was packed beyond fire code limits with 50-plus spectators who'd been following this soap opera like it was appointment television. Delilah arrived 20 minutes late looking like she'd been dressed by a tornado, wearing a wrinkled business suit that had probably seen better decades and carrying herself with all the confidence of someone walking to their own execution. Her new attorney, number 5 by my count, looked like he'd rather be prosecuting tax fraud in Milwaukee than defending this train wreck of a client. "Your Honor," he began with the enthusiasm of someone reading terms and conditions, "I've had insufficient time to review this complex case, but my client maintains her innocence regarding all property-related charges." It was the legal equivalent of showing up to a gunfight with a butter knife and apologizing for being underdressed. Stella stood up with the predatory grace of a shark who'd been circling wounded prey for months. She methodically presented the 1923 deed, the 1924 Mineral Rights Amendment, geological surveys, historical authentication, and enough documentation to choke a law library. The evidence table looked like an archaeological dig that had uncovered proof of legal ownership going back a century. DNR agent Kowalski testified about environmental violations that made Love Canal look like a nature preserve, showing photographs of dead fish floating around septic outflows that could have illustrated a textbook chapter on how not to manage waterfront property. The courtroom smelled like justice with a side order of environmental protection. That's when Delilah's carefully constructed facade finally cracked like cheap veneer. She interrupted the proceedings by shooting to her feet and screaming, "This is all fake! He's bribing everyone! The whole government is corrupt and they're all in on this conspiracy against honest business people!" Judge Blackwood's gavel came down with the authority of thunder, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a sword through silk. "Ms. Thornbrook, or whoever you claim to be today, you will maintain order in my courtroom, or I will have you removed in restraints." But Delilah was past the point of rational behavior, waving printed Facebook screenshots like they were constitutional amendments and claiming vast conspiracies involving corrupt veterans, fake historical documents, and government officials who hate successful women. The woman had completely disconnected from reality faster than a space shuttle leaving Earth's atmosphere. When Rosa Martinez began explaining the mineral rights violations, complete with geological surveys showing $2.3 million in gravel deposits beneath illegally constructed cabins, Delilah's attorney made a statement that echoed through the courthouse like the final bell at a boxing match. "Your Honor, after reviewing the evidence presented, we have no legal basis whatsoever for claiming ownership of the disputed property." The mic drop moment came when Stella presented her final exhibit. High-definition video footage of Delilah instructing her construction crew to lose permit applications and coaching Harold Finch to remember the handshake deal differently. The woman who'd spent months claiming moral high ground had been caught red-handed, orchestrating a conspiracy that would have impressed organized crime bosses. Delilah collapsed into her chair like a deflated balloon, sobbing words that will forever be remembered in Winnebago County legal history. "But I built everything. I worked so hard. It's not fair that some old piece of paper can destroy my whole life." Judge Blackwood's response was delivered with the precision of a surgical strike. "Ms. Thornberry, and yes, we know who you really are. The court orders immediate cessation of all commercial activity on Pine Needle Island, forfeiture of all improvements as compensation for trespass and environmental damage, and referral of criminal charges to appropriate federal authorities." The gallery erupted in spontaneous applause that had to be gavelled down, while DNR agents simultaneously served environmental cleanup orders and sheriff's deputies escorted the sobbing defendant from the courthouse. The media captured every moment of her complete breakdown for the evening news, creating footage that would become required viewing in property law classes for decades to come. Outside the courthouse, with Lake Winnebago visible in the distance and American flags waving overhead, I held up my great-grandfather's original deed for photographers who'd turned this legal victory into front-page news across 3 states. Veterans in the crowd saluted while environmental activists hugged each other and wept with relief. The woman who'd stolen my family legacy was finally facing consequences, but more importantly, the lake was about to be restored to the natural beauty that had inspired 4 generations of Caldwell family memories. Justice had been served with a side of environmental protection, and it tasted better than any meal I'd ever eaten. 6 months later, Pine Needle Island looked like Mother Nature had hired the world's best restoration crew and given them an unlimited budget. The DNR environmental teams had worked miracles, removing contaminated soil and replanting native wildflowers that now swayed in the lake breeze like they were welcoming visitors back to paradise. The sound of eagles calling overhead replaced the noise of construction equipment, and for the first time in years, I could smell clean lake water instead of septic system failures. I'd established the Ezra Caldwell Environmental Education Foundation, using the $1.2 million in court-awarded damages, turning the island into a hands-on learning laboratory, where local school kids could discover what healthy ecosystems actually look like. Watching 8-year-olds catch their first fish in waters that had been dead zones just months earlier felt better than any revenge fantasy I'd ever imagined. The veterans of foreign wars got weekend camping privileges for PTSD therapy programs, creating a space where guys like me could find peace without someone trying to charge us $350 a night for the privilege. Saturday mornings on the island now featured the sound of veterans sharing stories around campfires instead of tourists complaining about Wi-Fi speeds. As for Dolores Delilah Thornberry, karma delivered justice with the efficiency of a Swiss watch. After pleading guilty to federal fraud charges to avoid a trial that would have lasted longer than some marriages, she was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. The Illinois victims she'd defrauded finally got some closure, even if they never recovered their stolen retirement money. Her complete financial collapse was so thorough it could have been used as a case study in business schools under what not to do when you're already in legal trouble. The cabin demolition materials were donated to Habitat for Humanity, turning her illegal empire into affordable housing for families who actually deserve decent places to live. Even her BMW was auctioned off, with proceeds funding water quality monitoring equipment for the entire lake. Personal healing came in waves, like the gentle lapping of lake water against the dock of the new cabin I'd built using sustainable materials and green technology. My scattered family started showing up for the first reunions in 15 years, drawn back to the island by curiosity about the legal battle they'd been following on social media. Cousins I hadn't seen since childhood brought their own kids to experience the same magic that had shaped my youth. The best surprise was meeting Sandra Ellis, an environmental lawyer who'd volunteered with the restoration project and shared my passion for protecting natural spaces from people who viewed them as profit opportunities. Turns out, there's something romantic about fighting for environmental justice together, especially when you win and get to enjoy the results over morning coffee while watching sunrise paint the lake in shades of gold. The legal precedents we'd established rippled across Wisconsin like stones thrown into still water. Jasper's Law strengthened property ownership verification requirements, making it much harder for future con artists to pull similar scams. 3 other lake communities discovered and challenged illegal developments after learning about our case, proving that sometimes one victory can inspire others to fight for what's rightfully theirs. Environmental groups started using our case as a template for similar legal challenges, while veterans advocacy organizations cited our island therapy programs as models for other states. The documentary filmmakers who'd bought our story rights turned it into a Netflix special that made environmental protection look cooler than superhero movies. But the most meaningful moment came during our first annual Pine Needle Island Environmental Days, when Harold and Margaret Kowalski, the elderly Illinois couple Dolores had defrauded, visited to see what their stolen money had inadvertently helped create. Watching them smile while their grandchildren learned about water conservation felt like the universe had finally balanced its books. Standing on the dock my great-grandfather had built, fishing with his old rod while children laughed during a school field trip, I realized Ezra had been right about victory being bigger than just winning. The island now served hundreds of people instead of enriching one criminal, and the eagles nesting overhead for the first time in 20 years seemed to approve of the changes. Ready to share your own HOA horror story? Drop it in the comments below. We read every single one. And some of these nightmares might become future videos that help other people fight back against petty tyrants with clipboards. If you love seeing justice served with environmental protection on the side, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Next week, City Council tried to steal my 100-year-old oak tree. The arborist's report made them pay $50,000. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's building something so beautiful that everyone remembers what could have been accomplished through honesty instead of theft.
That's all for today's HOA madness. If watching justice serve itself made your day, smash that like button, share your thoughts down below, and make sure you're subscribed. More outrageous neighborhood showdowns are just around the corner.